You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hi, I'm Solomon Stein, and I'm a research fellow here at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Today is Friday, February 26th, 2016, and I'm joined here with Roger Koppl. And Roger Koppl is a professor of finance at the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University. And he's a faculty fellow at the university's Forensic and National Security Science Institute. He's also the author of Big Players in the Economic Theory of Expectations and From Crisis to Confidence, Macroeconomics After the Crash, as well as numerous articles and topics as wide-ranging as phenomenology, forensic science, computability theory, and Austrian economics. And so I'm very glad to be joined here by Roger. And so to start off, just looking at those topics, right, those sort of span a very wide conceptual space. And so you might initially think that they're kind of random, but I imagine that you see a connection between them. How do you understand that relationship between the various pieces of your work?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Solomon. Appreciate it. Well, it's all, in my head at least, it's all Austrian epistemics. So Hayek in 1937 writes Economics and Knowledge, this famous paper that came out of really the fight over socialist calculation. There was Mises, who in 1920 says, socialism isn't going to work the way you guys think it is. It's not really going to outperform capitalism. On the contrary, it'll be a mess. And so it's not going to generate these good results you think it's going to generate. And Hayek picked up on this argument, and they had a hard time convincing the profession. And Hayek realizes the problem is knowledge. They have these part of the problem is knowledge. These folks are thinking like the knowledge is just somehow given. The knowledge, whatever that is somehow given. And so they're thinking like guys in the ivory tower with like books and paper. But actually, when people are engaged in economic activity, the driving knowledge isn't in books and on paper. It's in our habits, our customs, our exchanges. It's embodied in strange ways. The egg timer, tells you when to take the egg out of the boiling water. So that's knowledge. It's not in your head. So this is just a different picture of knowledge. So in 1937, Hayek writes this paper, Economics and Knowledge, trying to make some of these kind of points. And he says later in 1979 in Hayek on Hayek, this famous sort of book of self-reflection and interviews of Hayek, he says there, this is my big contribution to economic theory, is that 37 paper and related papers from that time. So that's and he says in the 37 paper that, look, once you start thinking about all these issues, you discover this issue of the division of knowledge. That's maybe even more important than the division of labor. In economics, we're always talking about the division of labor, but we don't ever talk about the division of knowledge. It's probably actually the more important topic. So if you just think of it in that perspective, it's like, oh my goodness, this is a huge topic. So no kidding if we range, across a set of subtopics that otherwise don't seem very much related to one another. Now, one of the really weird, if I may continue.
Please.
One of the really sort of weird linkages, right? I've got under the same umbrella, I've got this like Alfred Schutz phenomenology, Henri Bergson type of stuff like that. That's very philosophical. Doesn't seem to have anything to do with mathematics. Could also seem, and sometimes I have to confess, is, depending on who the thinker is, vague, even sort of mystification. And then I got that under the same umbrella with like Turing machines and all this so-called computability math that comes ultimately out of the famous Gödel's theorem of 1931, where in some sense he shows that it's difficult to state in a brief compass coherently what exactly the statement is. But in some sense, it's saying that if you have that math is always open ended. Right. That you can't somehow lay down a finite set of axioms and then crank those axioms to produce all the true theorems in economics. Can't do it. I mean, in math, pardon me, can't do
Although it does apply to economics as well.
Well, I think so, and I've made some forays into exactly that effort. So how do those two things? How are they in the same box? Well, the thing is this: if you take seriously the Gödel-Turing phenomenon, if you take seriously this incompleteness of mathematics, this undecidability of many mathematical propositions, then the effort to somehow systematize all our understanding of all dimensions of human knowledge so that we can reduce somehow, we can have a theory of human knowledge or a theory of society that somehow is the algorithmic crank. Here's the scientific premises. We feed it into the computer, we turn the crank, and out comes every possible truth. That can't be right. It doesn't work in pure math. Okay, so any applied mathematical topic with sufficient complexity, it's not going to work there either. Okay, and so what happens then in a world where there's these inaccessible these domains of knowledge inaccessible to our explicit scientific reason? Okay, well, in the world of human action, that gets filled in with understanding in exactly that old philosophical sense from guys like Dilthey, Alfred Schutz, Henri Bergson, and others, the so-called Lebensphilosophia group.
Okay, and so you came at sort of the expectations being the solution to this mathematical problem, or these sort of subjectivist threads that you see in the phenomenology. And that sort of leads you eventually to this work, right? The big players and the economic theory of expectations. So how did you come to think of expectations as being the central problem, and, which it was in your sort of early work? And, how is Schutz, and I guess I understand your influence of Schutz comes from Fritz Machlup. Could you talk a little about sort of that path towards the big players idea?
Actually, the first name to mention in this connection is Ludwig Lockmann. I had the extraordinary good fortune to be a student at NYU in the early 1980s when there was, of course, Kerzner and also Ludwig Lockmann and Roger Garrison and Larry White and Bruce Caldwell and on and on and on. It was just Dick Langlois. It was just amazing group of people. So I was there. And very important in this ambiance, very important in this environment is Ludwig Lockmann. And Lockmann always put the question of expectations. Always put the question of expectations. Lockmann was convinced, rightly I think, that expectations are subjective. So if you've got a mathematical model of economic expectations, probably there's some very severe limits to that model. Okay? I would not say, well, if it's a mathematical model of expectations, ipso facto it's wrong, something like that. I don't think you can say that. But it must ought to have some limits, right? Because expectations are really subjective. So Lockmann put this point very, 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 very hard to us all in NYU in those years. I don't think he had like a good solution for this, but he had a really deep, important, central problem that follows right out of the same Hayek 1937 paper. Let us remember, Lockmann was a student of Hayek's of sorts. He had his training in Berlin, but worked under Hayek in London as a kind of sort of young refugee scholar.
So Lockmann sort of attempted to present what he thought was a solution to the problem in his work in The Legacy of Max Weber. Where do you see that not getting at the solution, or at least sort of, that initial direction towards institutions as these points of orientation for these subjective coordination of expectations?
I don't think that he's wrong to say that. I just don't think that fills in all that much, right? I don't. That's more like wisdom than theory. So absolutely, it's all about institutions. But fill that out and make it into a theory of expectations is not something Lachman himself did. So that was kind of a project for me. I wanted to do that. Then the other crucial piece, I remember it vividly. I was studying under Leland Yeager at Auburn University in Alabama, and Dick Langlois came down to give a talk to the Department of Economics on a methodological topic. And my beloved teacher, the great Leland Yeager, had some fun joking, well, I'm going to let you out of class to go to Langlois' lecture today. The topic is, well, forgive me for using a dirty word, but the topic is methodology. And he kind of smiles and chuckles because he's put down methodology. Of course, the truth is Leland Yeager has written some very great and important things on methodology. His real objection, of course, is to substituting sort of blather about methodology for doing good science. Okay? That was really his objection, and I certainly hope I have never done that, although one never knows. So I loved methodology. I had the good fortune to have worked with Dick Langlois and co-authored a paper by the time he came down to speak at Auburn on this occasion. And I felt a little huffy that my beloved Professor Yeager would say such a thing. And in my vexation, it occurred to me that one could apply. I remember I was walking down the hall to Langlois' lecture, and it occurred to me that one could apply the methodological logic articulated by Fritz Machlup in his 1937 paper, Why Methodology Matters, to the problem of economic expectations. Take the same insight that is at the core of rational expectations, that economic expectations are essentially economic theory applied at the agent level, okay? But take it out of this sort of mathematical general equilibrium context and put it into this kind of phenomenological context, the Schutzian context, okay? And it gives you a very different theory of expectations. So that was the analytical key. So Lachman gave me the problem. Machlup, 1937, Why Bother with Methodology, gave me the analytical key to sort of unlock the thing, and then the book just kind of followed from that.
And so what did the analytical apparatus look like once you sort of got those two pieces together? Sort of what is the big player's notion?
Right. So the key from sort of the highest level of abstraction, if that's okay to go there for a second, the key is the anonymity of the economic actor. So how much do I have to know about someone to model them crossing the street? Well, not much, right? So I don't have to fill in your psychological detail to understand that you're going to wait for the light, and then when the light turns, you're going to go, and so on. I have to know something about you. I have to know that you are familiar with life in a modern city, for example, and won't be confused by the lights or something like this. But I don't need to know much about you. How much do I need to know about you to understand, what career choice you're going to make or what you're going to order at dinner or something like this? Well, now much more, right? So Machlup's point in Why Bother with Methodology is that what we call economic theory, and this is, as he says himself quite clearly, this is straight out of Schutz. What we call economic theory is mostly about these relatively high anonymous actors. Okay? Then we can have actually some predictive theories. If it's okay for me to model the actors without knowing all that much about them in particular and get some conclusion, then that conclusion is probably pretty reliable. Well, says Machlup, what about something like, how the central bank is going to behave, what central bank policy is going to be? No, you got to really know who the central bankers are, right? So you have to have a pretty detailed, concrete model of who those actors are. And now it looks more like history than theory. So I draw from this the inference that, predictive predictions based on low anonymity ideal types, predictions based on a model of somebody that's got to be laid out in some psychological detail, they're less reliable. Okay? Now, once I bring that insight into my understanding of how people form economic expectations, suddenly I realize, if I'm trying to outguess the central banker, if I'm trying to psych out the central banker, good luck with that. Okay? So if I have instead a decentralized monetary regime where there is no central banker, okay, then anonymous ideal types will do, right? Just a general understanding that, banks respond to their incentives, and the usual customs will be followed, allows me to have confidence in my expectation about things like future prices, and maybe even make some reasonable guesses about future interest rates. When I have to psych out the central banker, well, I can't.
So you're sort of connecting the coordination of knowledge to the fact that when we're coordinating, and it doesn't matter who in particular I am for this, as long as you know that, say, I'm a human actor, right? So this is sort of the understanding I've always had of what Schutz is doing is there's this critique of Max Weber's use of the ideal type, yep, right, by Mises, that says, look, when you're dividing up people by these sorts of action they do, right, you have action based on values, you have action based on rationality, etc. Those are all going to be action in the... He really says it's all rational action and that it's all goal-oriented. And so Schutz is trying to say, well, if we think about what that is, that's just the most anonymous ideal type. And that sort of allows for the ideal type to an economic theory to merge in a way that Mises, with his sharp distinction between theory and history, says ideal types as historical things, like Weber says, can't be the same as theory that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think you're getting at the right point there in terms of Mises versus Schutz. So Mises was trying to make economics a priori. It's not entirely clear, what he even meant by that, or whether he was self-consistent what he said about that. But he was somehow trying to make it sort of like, geometry. It's all a priori, just, clear thinking, and then that's economic theory. But Mises was a smart guy. He recognized, okay, but we got to fill in these ancillary assumptions with more, particular content. So there's nothing in a priori knowledge that says labor's obnoxious, but generally for most people at the margin, less labor is toilsome. We don't like it. Less is better. So that's an empirical assumption, right? So that's off the highest level of pure theory. So somehow Mises was trying to, on lines like this, he was trying to make some kind of sharp distinction between pure theory and then, something that's history. And Schutz, I think, really showed convincingly that this was an error, that there's a gradation. At the very highest level of abstraction, the sort of greatest level of purity, if you wish, it really pretty much is all just pure reasoning. We have some idea about people act toward ends and so on. So just our knowledge of this sort of inner logic of human action is all we need. We don't need any actual experiential knowledge to work out the conclusions. And then as we go down to lower and lower and lower levels of anonymity, more and more concrete understanding of particular facts, not just that people generally don't like to work, but, that we're now in the Industrial Revolution, or we're in a medieval German village, or whatever like that. Now, at some point, we're clearly ending up in history. Okay, well, where do you draw the line between theory and history? Schutz showed it's largely a matter of taste. Okay, that's the analytical distinction there between Schutz and Mises. And I think Schutz was right, and I don't think Mises ever absorbed the lesson, even though he clearly points to Schutz a couple of times and says this guy's important and wonderful.
So I can see now, I think, in that description, how you get towards forensics. So would you talk a little bit about sort of how you see sort of the big players issue, or just expectations and knowledge in general, since that's been a big part of your work more recently?
Well, yeah. So in the big players theory, in the theory of expectations, one of the things that helps to generate prescient expectations is competition. Because competition constrains us. And the more tightly you are constrained, the less discretion you have, then the less I have to know about you in order to have a good idea what you're going to do. Okay. Now, when we turn to forensic science, the shocking discovery I made at a certain point was we have no competition in forensic science. It's what I call monopoly epistemics. If the police send you the crime lab evidence, the chance that evidence is going to show up in any other crime lab is very low. almost might as well be zero. Okay, but maybe not quite zero. Cases get reopened, but low probability. Anybody, other crime lab's going to look at that evidence. Not only that, it's a low probability that any other crime lab or forensic, set of analysts would interpret the consequences of the meaning of the tests that you did. Okay, so we have this twofold monopoly in forensic science of both test and interpretation. Well, there again, that lack of competition we may suspect is going to generate poor results, and I think I show that unfortunately it does in forensic science. The problem, one of the problems, there's a couple of problems with monopoly epistemics in forensic science. One of them, one set of problems is just stuff like, these crime labs are organized under the police, they're working for the police, so there's terrible bias, and then there's no competition among the crime labs, so there's nothing to check or counter or balance that bias, so it's just a one-way street. So that's terrible. There's also the fact that if you have a monopoly on the interpretation of the evidence, the testing and interpretation of the evidence that's sent to you, we never get a reality check on your work. You might be super conscientious, trying to do everything right, be a scientist, all of that. You are great. But if there's some infirmity in what you're doing, we'll never know because we never get a reality check on your work. So that's another way how, this monopoly epistemics just is contrary to the goal of veracity.
So something that also occurs to me, and that is actually that when you just talk about how now you have to know a lot about the sort of non-anonymous particulars of each individual forensic expert, if the goal of sort of these systems is both veracity but also predictability in the sort of sense of a rule of law, right? I don't know if your work has explored this in particular, but it's sort of endangering.
That's a new thought for me, so I don't have a response to that, but that's very interesting. Certainly the rule of law is real important. I'm an advocate of the rule of law. The rule of law is not so easily achieved. It's got to have the right institutional structure. You're saying that monopoly epistemics is, in some degree, frustrates the rule of law. I think that's right.
Yeah,
I think that's right. I think that's a terrific insight.
In the sort of, the rule of law is about this sort of objective, predictable, universal application of a set of principles, but this is a very particular, non-anonymous application.
Because the forensic scientist, in many cases, is making a subjective judgment. And when he's got a monopoly right to make that subjective judgment, then that's pure discretion. And the essence of the rule of law is the absence of discretion. So that's a wonderful connection, and I think you're quite right about that.
So in a different context, you have been not quite a monopoly expert, but you were the editor of Advances in Austrian Economics, which was a long-running and I believe a long-running series of they're sort of in between an edited volume and a journal sort of. So sort of what was it like being that? How does your work on, expertise and epistemics influence being an editor and just sort of, everything about the publishing process?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to be called an expert editor or an expert anything after all my work on experts. The term expert, which most of the time is like, oh, that's great. Now I'm like, oh, I'm skeptical of that.
Placed in a position of having expertise and decision authority.
Yeah. Well, that's right. It's a problem, right? Because you do have to make a decision as an editor. So you do always worry that, am I sort of exercising my discretion, wisely, prudently, appropriately, or am I just like being unpleasant or something? But, unlike forensic science, in academic journals and research annuals, I always called the Advances a research annual. There is competition. There are other journals. Right? So if you go off the rails, well, that's bad. You shouldn't go off the rails. But there is, in the system, there is some corrective. But you wanted to know what, just sort of what I learned from that, or
yeah, and both sort of
how was the experience?
There's competition, but as we know, it's not a over homogeneous product. Yeah, so what was sort of where did you see your product differentiation to be, and also?
Oh well, what we tried to do, what I tried to do as editor, and then later Steve Horowitz was my co-editor. We were trying to make it's explicit in our editorial philosophy, written down in the first volume of Advances that I edited, We were trying to bridge the Austrian tradition with non-Austrian traditions. So I kind of think of Austrian economics as certainly not as a body of doctrine, but as a tradition. And to me, the tradition really it's the Mises-Kreis in Vienna. In other words, there was Ludwig von Mises in Vienna, and he would meet regularly with this group of other Viennese thinkers in this so-called circle. So this was one of many circles, the Schlichtkreis being the famous one. That's the so-called what out in the outside world was called the Vienna Circle, but in Vienna they had all these many circles. So there was Mises. He would meet with these guys regularly, and it was an amazing group of people. So to me, that's kind of everything that comes down from that is the Austrian tradition. Well, there are other traditions. There are other traditions within economics. There are other traditions within social science. There's other traditions outside of even social science, where there may be fruitful communication, fruitful exchange with the Austrian tradition. After all, the point of the division of labor is to exchange. It's the system of specialization and exchange. So if you have all specialization, no exchange, that's what's the profit in that? So the very first volume I edited, if my memory is correct, tried to draw links to the entrepreneurship tradition. There's this wonderful, relatively new literature on entrepreneurial studies. We now have PhD programs and departments and journals, all on entrepreneurial studies. I think this is a great development, and I've long felt that we need a richer communication between and more brisk trade between the Austrian tradition and this emergent new tradition of entrepreneurial studies. So that was my first volume, and I'm very proud of it. And I was able to get many wonderful contributors, including Will Baumel, who wrote, I think, a beautiful paper on Austrian entrepreneurial studies and Austrian economics.
So just an interesting note, given your discussion of Lachmann earlier, is there's a paper, I believe in 1979, he writes, where at the very end of it, he actually defends the idea of being a very self-conscious member of a school. And so as someone who works on doctrinal history, I sort of feel compelled to defend the idea of Austrian economics as at least subjectively understood as a body of doctrine, right? And his argument is that in the same way that we all need to exchange, there only a market of entirely brokers is doomed to fail. And he says that it's comforting sometimes to know where one belongs in that sense.
I don't recall that paper. I may have read it and I don't recall it anymore.
It's at the very end of a note on Hicks, I believe. But
then probably have read it at some point. But anyway, I don't remember that argument. I mean, look, our first. I think if you asked me to put on my philosopher of science hat, I think schools of thought are good. But also inevitable, because we're primates. We human beings were primates, and the human primates fall into factions and groups, and the groups, grow hostile to one another. That's just somehow in our hardwiring. So it's inevitable, but I also think it's good because it's a part of the division of cognitive labor in science. So that's fine. But for each of us great, wonderful, all that. On the other hand, for each of us as an individual, you really got to go. You have an obligation to go where the truth takes you. So if you're raised in a tradition, if you're in a school, it is only natural that you're disposed to believe in the doctrinal fundamentals of that school. Try as you might to be open-minded. It's likely, if you were raised in that tradition, that at least the preponderance of those doctrinal positions are going to be your positions as well. But if you find instead that this, that, or the other piece of doctrine is no longer persuasive to you, you got to tell the truth like you see it. That's your first duty. And indeed, why would you do this work if that wasn't your attitude? Go be a businessman. I mean, it's great it's lovely work being a intellectual and a college professor. It's great work, but it's not the way. Nobody became a billionaire tycoon by being a good college professor.
Well, I think certainly the fact that Lachmann made that, and he's sort of famous for being the gadfly of that time at NYU, and but he was the one who was saying, no, it's still comforting to be a member of a school.
That's a great point. There's a charming irony in the fact that this gadfly, who was so discombobulating to the pre-existing Austrian vision, was himself extolling the glories of a school. That's great.
So beyond Machlup and Kerzner and Lockman, were there any other big influences in you? Oh, and Jaeger.
Jaeger was a big influence.
Your time at NYU or at Auburn. How did you get to NYU in the first place? Sort of where did you?
Well, I was a economics student at Cleveland State University. I loved economics. It was really interesting. But I found the topics and the questions more interesting than the models. I graduated from Cleveland State University in 1980. So, I mean, this was the nadir for interesting economics. I mean, certainly, especially at the level of undergraduate pedagogy. I mean, it was just mind-numbing stuff. So the introductory micro, the principles micro, okay, that was cool because that's really the core of economics. So that was great. And then intermediate micro was still pretty good, although now we're drawing indifference curves and all this stuff, and it's sort of neat, and it's puzzle solving and stuff, and it's cool and it's fun, but it doesn't have the same fresh excitement as the principles class. And the intermediate macro was just a nightmare because it's like the professor writes an equation on the board, and then somehow that's reality, which I could never understand that. So these were the sorts of experiences I was having as an undergraduate. The topics were terribly important. The really core of it, the micro you learn in those days it was Principles 2. You did Principles 1 was macro, Principles 2 was micro. So the micro you did in Principles 2, that's the real stuff. It was just wonderful. And the rest of it was just dry. And the more advanced your studies, the drier it got. So that kind of put me on the path to seeking out, because I at that point I was hooked. I wanted to somehow be a scholar if I could, but I didn't know if I wanted to do economics because it was so dry. It didn't seem like they were really getting at the questions. And a philosopher at Cleveland State, who was actually only visiting Cleveland State, named Roger Pryor, told me that I should look into this Austrian stuff. There was Kerzner's The Economic Point of View, and I just felt like, oh, this is it. This is it. They're asking the right questions. They're at the right level of sort of, human understanding with this stuff. Economics is now about human beings and not about the curves. This was the big problem. You take, as I said, what was in those days Principles 2, you take that first microeconomics class and you're talking about human beings. Then you get in the advanced classes and you're talking about curves. What happened to the human beings? So I just was very excited about that. I didn't really know very much about Austrian economics. And by the time for a brief period, I considered myself a libertarian as an undergraduate, but that was, a matter of a few weeks. By the time I got to NYU to study as a graduate student, I totally repudiated any feeling of being a libertarian. So it's kind of an odd experience. I showed up very excited about the questions, very aware of who Kerzner was, very aware of who Mises was, but not very well informed, actually, on the Austrian tradition, nor even much of a libertarian. And yet they were kind enough to take me in their program and fund my studies as a budding Austrian economist, and it was a wonderful experience.
So one thing I didn't mention in your opening bio, but that is always proudly displayed in it most places, is that you have an Erdős number of 3. And
forgot about that.
So
That's right.
if I had to tell anybody that there's an economist with an Erdős number of 3, they would not guess Austrian.
That's
so,
right.
How did that come about? Where is that interest from? Right, the computability obviously ties into the epistemics, but the particulars of working in the math of it.
Well, yeah, I think I first acquired. I'm not quite sure, but I think I first. Well, first of all, wait a minute. We better explain what an Erdős number.
Oh yes.
It looks like it ought to be pronounced Erdős, and I for a long time said mistakenly Erdős, because it's. Leaving out the so-called diacritic marks, little dots and dashes and check marks and stuff over the letters. The name is spelled E-R-D-O-S.
Yes.
Paul, but apparently it's pronounced something more like Erdős. So Paul Erdős was a famous mathematician. It was said by one wag in reference to Erdős that mathematics is a machine for turning coffee into theorems. And the joke was that Erdős consumed amphetamines and coffee and was always a little bit wired. And that's how he did his math. So apparently he was quite a character. Apparently, if you're a mathematician, you may get a knock at the door one day. And, a Sunday morning, you're in your bathrobe and pajamas, and you open the door, and there's Paul Erdős. And he says, "Hello, let's write some theorems."
Yeah, is your mind open?
You're right. And so he lives with you for like 2 weeks or a month or however long, and you write 3 papers, and then he goes on and knocks on somebody else's door. This apparently was the lifestyle of Paul Erdős. So he wrote many papers. So it's like the 6 degrees of separation. It's like, the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, right? Have you co-authored with Paul Erdős? Have you co-authored with somebody who co-authored with Paul Erdős? Have you co-authored? So Paul Erdős is the only one with an Erdős number of 0. His co-authors have an Erdős number of 1. Okay, and then a few hundred people, if I recall correctly, have an Erdős number of 2. And then there's 3. So I proudly say that I have an Erdős number of 3.
And through you, it is propagated through many Austrians now as well.
Now, I think I first got a finite Erdős number from co-authoring a paper actually that used. I think the first way I got it was co-authoring a paper with Barclay Rosser on bubbles, complex bubble formation in closed-end country funds. And then we later went on to write a paper, co-authored paper on applying notions of computability to economics. So at that point, I had a finite Erdős number. But then, surprisingly, it was my work in forensic science that got my Erdős number down from about 6 to 3, 5 or 6 to 3, because one of the people who works in forensic science on some of the sort of technical problems of Bayesian inference and things like this is a guy named Sandy Zabel, who's a mathematician at Northwestern. And Sandy Zabel has an Erdős number of 2. We wrote a small note for a forensic science journal on something, Sandy, myself, and several other people. But it was published. It was original research, so we have a collaboration. So with Sandy as my co-author, I now have an Erdős number of 3.
So you mentioned your collaboration with Barclay Rosser, who's a noted sort of, I guess, also heterodox economist.
Yes.
I don't really know where to put him in the handy list of schools. I don't really think of him as necessarily a rigid post-Keynesian. He's not an old institutionalist. He's sort of there and very interesting.
Well, when Barclay and I met, and when we wrote together, we may very well write together again in the future, but it's been a few years since we've written anything together. So when we met and when we wrote together, he was identified by others and identified himself as a post-Keynesian. As far as I know, I think he still maintains that identity. But it's true that he's very broad. He's important now, actually. He's become important within the Austrian school. Comes up here to George Mason often to visit. So it's true that it's difficult to classify, to categorize Barclay and his work. It's quite interestingly idiosyncratic and broad.
Around a decade ago, in fact, I believe a decade ago this year, you were president of the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics, and your presidential address dealt with sort of this broad heterodox notion and was titled Austrian Economics at the Cutting Edge. And so how did you sort of understand where that cutting edge was then? And importantly, I think, the question of the decade is the nice round number for retrospective. How have things changed in Austrian economics, in the rest of the discipline? Where do you see sort of the F.A. Hayek program fitting into your vision of that, or how you see it now?
I mean, it's amazing. It's great. The key word is complexity. There was this Santa Fe complexity movement, okay, which interestingly, one of the original architects was a guy named Ken Arrow. So it's kind of funny how some of these things are connected. So, at least as the story is usually told, some people object to this story, but as the story is usually told, we got PCs. Professors got PCs on their desktops at a certain point, and they started playing with them. And this was a new tool that allowed them to develop and think about and talk about and draw inferences from complexity models. So Brian Arthur, Stuart Kaufman, and others were the original founders of the Santa Fe Institute of course, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that tried to work out the complexity theory and the implications of complexity in the natural and social sciences. Well, it took off within economics. It has transformed economics. When Paul Krugman received the Nobel Prize, it was for work that used the tools of complexity theory. Okay, so I kind of think of that as the complexity prize. And Barclay is very important in that. Barclay Rosser is very important in that group. Another co-author of mine, Stu Kaufman, is very important in that group. So in the presidential address you referred to, it seemed to me that this new complexity theory was transforming mainstream economics to make it look way more Austrian. Because another guy that the complexity theorists talk a lot about is a guy named F.A. Hayek. And yet another guy that often comes in for a mention, as well he should, is a guy named Adam Smith. So somehow, Hayek says we were Darwinians before Darwin. We were also complexity theorists before Santa Fe. And so this is what I saw 10 years ago, was that this was taking off. It was gaining ground. I remember, I earlier in our chat, I discussed how tedious the economics was that I was learning in 1979 and 1980. That had changed by the time we get to my presidential address. After 1980, things really opened up. So all of a sudden, bounded rationality is a real thing, rule following is a real thing, institutions are real things, cognition is a real thing, evolution, expectations, these are all real things. Hence, BRICE, Bryce Economics. And in the 10 years since that address, it's shocking to me that it's been 10 years. That's amazing. In the 10 years since that I gave that address, things have only moved more in that direction. In fact, there's been a kind of convergence. Austrians have become, I think, much smarter about using tools outside of our sort of original tradition, including sometimes often mathematical tools like agent-based modeling, to develop Austrian themes and explore new ideas. And the rest of the profession, the so-called mainstream economics, has also picked up these same tools and thereby been driven to a more Austrian understanding of the market process. So it's a beautiful convergence. It's a great time to be an Austrian economist. We're very much, I think, on the vanguard. As I felt 10 years ago, I feel that even more today.
So, do you think there's a disconnect between, sometimes it's felt micro and macro in that regard? I know that, for instance, the other book we mentioned at the beginning is about macroeconomics after the crash, and so, there, do you think that those ideas have had the same penetration, or are we still?
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. No, I don't. But there's something really interesting about the crisis, because if you look, so we're talking about the crisis of 2008. Some people date it to 2007, but there was not only a recession or depression, but there was also the acute financial crisis that hit the fall of 2008. So one of the things that happened in the wake of the crisis was that economists who are not considered to be Austrian economists gave an Austrian interpretation of that crisis. So it's a pretty, I think, one of the sort of pro-Austrian, consequences of this terrible crisis that we sure would have rather not had is that it's now on the radar screen of mainstream macroeconomics that the interest rate mechanisms crucial to the Austrian theory of the trade cycle are real and important. Okay, so that's a huge, wonderful change. So far, though, the toolkit, the so-called DSGE modeling toolkit, that's not showing signs of passing away, which is disappointing. Many of us, myself included, thought, well, that's it for the old methods. Right now, finally, complexity theory, which has taken over all the rest of economics, is going to make a march on macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is finally going to give up all this non-complexity stuff of agent-based modeling, equilibrium always, general equilibrium.
Representative agent-based modeling as opposed to agent-based modeling, right?
Oh, did I say the wrong thing? Yeah, exactly.
Just to make sure that's
right.
Those are two very different things.
Absolutely, you bet they are, right? So in agent-based modeling, you have many heterogeneous agents, okay, generating unintendedly some macroscopic or macroeconomic outcome. And in the so-called DSGE modeling of mainstream macroeconomics, yes, representative agent modeling. So it's almost like anti-complexity, right?
Yeah. Professor Dick Wagner always says that if you were trying to model a traffic jam using representative agents, it would be one large car driving backwards.
That's right. So I thought that stuff was out the window. I thought it was the death knell for DSGE modeling, or at least I hope so. And I thought there was a good chance it would go. So far, it doesn't look like that's happening. So I can't say that complexity theory has invaded macro. It hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, you mentioned a very important name, Richard Wagner here at George Mason. He's working on making exactly such a march, and he has some very interesting and skilled students working with him on this project. So this could be another time when the Austrians are able to be in the vanguard, show the way, and maybe pull the rest of the profession finally in the right direction.
Yeah, in thinking about the title of the thing, From Crisis to Confidence, I think about also your work on experts, in that if you think about sort of the dialogue about how the policy responses in the crisis worked, you have, individuals inside the system seem to have the sort of triumphal, we did it, we saw what was going on, we flooded the market, we saved, the intermediation. And so in some ways that ties into me with your theories of expertise, in that, to understand Ben Bernanke and how he understood the crisis and his response, and then his sort of updating process in the wake of it, right? So Bernanke was not one of the people who decided that Hayek or Hyman Minsky or many other people who were sort of forgotten monetary theorists was suddenly coming in. Instead, and, as the person in power, this almost updated him towards confidence in the DSGE universe that he had risen to prominence in.
You're totally putting your finger on the right thing here. See, the point exactly is that the big rents in macroeconomics, the big rents are outside of the academy. It's that job like chairman of the Fed. So there's a rigid hierarchy that culminates out in being one of these powerful experts. Okay? So it's all about being an expert. It's all about control. It's the economics of control, updated. So that, I think, is the key to why complexity ideas have not made greater progress within macroeconomics, why the DSGE modeling technique has not been damaged by the crisis. Okay? And indeed, you said something really right. These guys are actually pluming themselves. Oh, look, we saved the day. Yay for us. Whereas if we had institutions that did not empower macroeconomic experts, we'd had a much less, we wouldn't have had the crisis.
Yeah. I recall one of the first things that got me personally into economics was a book written under the pseudonym Adam Smith called The Money Game. And there's a discussion in there of the Penn Central bailout, which is very much a 40-year presage of the financial crisis. And in there, he has a description where all the bankers are celebrating. And he says that we should always be worried when people, right? The banking is not supposed to be an exciting profession.
Yeah.
And so that's very much reminds me of the same thing.
How different, banking was in the past. Many of your listeners will have seen the old Walt Disney movie, Mary Poppins. And the bankers are all, in fact, the poor bankers get raked over the coals in that movie. But there's a certain truth in how they represent bankers of that era. They were very, staid, solid, reliable, steady on people. We no longer have such an image of bankers. Why? Because your reputation for prudent judgment, your reputation for prudence is no longer important to you as a bank or a banker because the government's got your backstop. We'll back you up. Okay, so this sort of sociological change in our mental image of bankers, who we now call often banksters, reflects a real institutional change.
Yeah, we have sort of it used to be that there were the bankers and they were the guys in the big plush office chairs, right? That now are like, parodied for being these old, and then they were the staid guys holding mutual funds, and then they were the speculators doing all this wild entrepreneurship,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
now, you have just the total combination because those people who were acting, right, holding the risk and the people who were willing to take the risk are just, well, as you said, right, they don't really need to take the risk. They just need to reap the speculative profit.
You and I are taking the risk,
Yeah.
not the people actually making the decisions. That's right.
So there's something also that's personally interesting to me about your time at NYU, which is that your years overlap very much with the beginnings of the sort of debate within Austrian economics between Kerzner and Lachmann over the nature of equilibration and how to think about equilibrium as a construct in the market process. So do you have any sort of recollections of that debate from your perspective? Where were you a Lachmannian or a Kersnerian? How did things go?
I was totally on Lachmann's side. Part of the issue with Lachmann was that he was empowering. He was empowering in part because when you met with him in his office, you were his equal. So that was wonderful. Now, Israel Kerzner is truly a humble man. So it's not like he was ever lording it over anyone. But Lachmann somehow had the ability to make you feel like he needed your insight. We are in this together. He just somehow was able to make you feel that way. So that was very empowering. And then he had this one word, and this one word was a club. You take any economic argument, any economic topic, you don't know anything about it, but you pick up your club and you can beat the hell out of it. And that word is expectations. So that was sort of glorious and horrible at the same time. It was glorious. It was very empowering, and it put me onto all these epistemic issues that I think are so important. On the other hand, I'm not actually learning to understand the world any better. I'm not actually making any progress in science if all I can do is pick up my club that says expectations and beat other people with it. So it's kind of, it was a blessing and a curse at the same time. I was totally on the Lachmann side. The others, I think in particular of George Selgin, they were on the Kerzner side. Well, this was great. We would fight with each other. We would have these arguments, and it made having these arguments made partisans among the graduate students on each side of the debate smarter and better. We were better scholars because of this, urgent fight, as we viewed it, between Lachmann and Kerzner.
Yeah. So you were around, I guess, 1982 would be the publication of The Market as an Economic Process, Lachmann's book. That for you also, like The Legacy of Max Weber, wasn't quite operational, I guess, enough?
My copy of that book is literally held together by Scotch tape. I got a paperback copy, and it's marked up and then marked up again, to the point where it's just falling apart. I mean, if I tug this a little bit on the front cover, it comes off. So that's a wonderful book. It's a great book. And the most important essay in that book is the 1942 essay, The Role of Expectations in Economics as a Social Science. So as much as I feel like I had to sort of get beyond the beautiful problem statement offered by Lachmann and use a different set of tools that he did not use in order to make progress on the problems he directed us to, that book points us to the problems. It's beautiful and very important.
So,
another book that came out about that time was O'Driscoll and Rizzo.
Yes, Economics of Time and Ignorance.
The Economics of Time and Ignorance. So that was really good luck to be in New York at NYU at the time that they were putting that book together. It just changed everything. And the sort of Kerzner camp viewed it as anathema at the time. I think now everybody understands. No, it's okay. You know what? O'Driscoll and Rizzo were right. This is sort of the new chapter in Austrian economics, etc. But at the time, it seemed to many. I was on again the O'Driscoll Rizzo side. I just love that book right from the start. But others who would now celebrate that book, rightly, at the time viewed it as just a disaster, just a big disaster.
Kersner and Lachman both reviewed it separately for the Market Process, the journal that was edited out of the Center for the Study of Market Process, now the Mercatus Center. And it's both of them are sort of each thinks that the position that Rizzo and O'Driscoll took was too much, conceding to the other side. So Kersner says, right, it seems like the middle between equilibrium always and complete nihilism is a razor thin edge, and they've fallen off. And then Lachman also says, no, like this is too much, sort of not explicitly too much equilibrium, but that they're sort of not pushing it as far as it could go.
And then what I've tried to argue, in my 2002 book on big players and the economic theory of expectations, is that where you are between these sort of poles of disequilibrium and equilibrium, how well the equilibration process is working, depends on big player influence. It depends on institutions, on the rules of the game. And so what we really have here is not a fight that we have to decide where between the two poles, is reality. What we have instead is the question, what institutional arrangements encourage us to go more toward the one pole, and what institutional arrangements instead tend to drive us toward the other pole. That's a theoretical issue, but it's also an empirical issue. It requires us to, as Pete Bucky so rightly says, to open up the window and look outside, right? Including, as I tried to do in the 2002 book, sometimes looking at numbers and, doing econometric tests and statistical analyses of those numerical data.
So with regards to institutions, something that was pushed recently by Pete Bedke, in fact, about Kersner's work and about the market process in general, is thinking about if we can use the tools of how we think about markets coordinating to think about institutional development. I know Pete has often sort of tried to say, like, is there a market process in institutional change? Do you, in a way that Kersner's theory would want to bracket that completely, where, while conceding, of course, that structures how you interact. How do you think people could approach that? Or
I hope I've understood your question correctly. I think the answer is we don't know. We need more minds on this topic. Let's try to figure it out. I think Israel Kersner tends to say, well, the institutional structure, and therefore including in particular and especially the definition of property rights, that's sort of a given. Market process theory happens within that context. Hayek tells the story of the evolution of institutions, as did Adam Smith, as did David Hume in his great History of England. So the view that it's just somehow outside of economic analysis what the institutional structure is seems to me mistaken. But that makes life difficult for us. This is a hard problem because, we want to say, oh, well, look at the institutional structure. That sets up certain incentives, and that sets up certain epistemic dynamic, and then that determines sort of outcomes for the system. Well, that's great, except that if the institutional structure itself is subject to entrepreneurial innovation, or just unintended, unconscious change, then we need somehow something more than just that, causal direction going from institutions to outcomes. It's clearly got to be an evolutionary story, and I think we have, as I said a moment ago, some precedents. We had Hume on this, we had Adam Smith on this, but I think we don't have it worked out that well how it works.
Yeah, and certainly the difference between our notion of coordination and so that we understand that the institutions change, but some of those changes in markets, we think, right, the Kersnerian insight is that there's a systematic element of those that's leading towards a particular kind of configuration. And, that is the sort of, there's the welfare conclusion that you would get out of being able to look and say, well, we're trending towards this more coordinated state given these institutions. But the evolution in Hayek or even in Smith or Hume is not towards any particular institutional configuration. And so...
Right, and in fact, it's almost worse than that, if I could put it that way. although I think the open-endedness of evolution is actually a good thing. But in terms of trying to get a grip on, how social processes work, it's almost like it's disappointing because they're so open-ended. So as humans, we should celebrate that, but trying to understand it, because evolution is creative. Even biological evolution is creative. There's a sense in which I think it's not a sorry, I'm a little low on blood sugar. It's not a it's not a law-governed system. There's a sense in which it's not a law-governed system, because in the standard sort of model of what a law-governed system is that we borrow from sort of classical mechanics, from physics, you write down the laws of motion for the system, you write down the initial conditions, and you turn the crank, and then the thing unfolds. Okay, at least up to a error term. Okay? But that's not actually how evolution works. We can't, the so-called phase space is not stable. In other words, at any moment, there's what Stu Kaufman calls beautifully the adjacent possible. There's all these possibilities, niches, if you will. And this is true in biological evolution, and it's true in social evolution. And the agents in the system, whether they're organisms, genes, molecules, persons, firms, okay, will seize some of those opportunities or niches existing in the adjacent possible. Most of them will not be seized. The system iterates, and now you have a new set of possibilities in the adjacent possible. Some of them will be seized, others, most of them will not be, and the system iterates again, and so on. And the thing is that you can't list all the possibilities and all the adjacent possible futures that are going to unfold in the system. There's literally too many of them to list. There are uncountably many of them, so you can't, more than uncountably many of them, I think, in my estimation. So what you can't do is write down these laws of motion in the first place, because that requires a stable phase space, like the space in which events can happen. But if the space in which events can happen is changing, if the dimensions of the system are changing in unpredictable ways, you can't write down those initial laws of motion. So the system is really open-ended. If the system is open-ended, then, equilibration, disequilibration, that changes the dynamic on that. If I freeze the institutional structure, freeze the evolutionary process, and ask where the system is headed, okay, that's an old-fashioned, straightforward market process, equilibration story. But if I unfreeze them, I can say less about where the system is headed at any moment.
Yeah, I see that as very related to the critique that Buchanan put down very quickly in order defined in the process of its emergence, and longer in The Market as a Creative Process, his article with Victor Vanberg, where he talks about the sort of inescapable teleology of equilibrium, and that even Kerzner can't quite get away from the idea that there's sort of a future tapestry that can sort of be unrolled versus this sort of creative future. And I guess that's also part of the argument in your most recent article against design.
Yeah, that's right. That's that evolutionary argument that I was trying to outline was exactly the thing behind it, the article against design. That's right. But there's kind of an easy resolution for Kerznerians on this, because if you think about the evolutionary story I just told, okay, so it's the system, not necessarily a creative individual, but it's the system that's generating novel opportunities. And that's got to be right if you think about biological evolution, right? Because, maybe you want to say that, leopards and gazelles are creative. Why not? They have central nervous systems. They're not so different from we humans as we might wish to believe. But in earlier stages of biological evolution, no, you're talking about organisms that don't have a central nervous system. So the idea of imputing to them some sort of individual creativity seems askew. And yet, this process of biological evolution generated all these novel possibilities. Okay? So the resolution for a lot of issues we have with Kerznerian entrepreneurship versus, Schakelian discovery, Schakelian creativity, is just to recognize that it's the system itself that generates the new possibilities. Right. So then, once it's generated, entrepreneurs may discover an objectively existing opportunity that is new, that didn't exist before. So it's not necessarily a prior error is implied in that. It's a new possibility that did not exist before. That's what's happening. So I retain strongly the notion of Kersnerian discovery. I don't think we need to impute to entrepreneurs any particular creativity, ex nihilo creation. We can stick with the idea of discovery rather than creation of opportunities if we recognize that novel opportunities, new opportunities, are being created by the system itself, and the entrepreneur is the guy who discovers them.
I suppose let me display my radical Lachmanian flag here by saying so. One of the implications of that view, though, it seems really difficult to reconcile with a tool where both will say is one of the most useful things in economics, which is simple partial equilibrium analysis. Because if it's the case that, use the example from Kirchner's article distinguishing him from Schumpeter, the horse and buggy industry, the eve of the invention of the automobile, is an industry in profound disequilibrium, then it seems like what can we say in a Marshallian framework about the horse and buggy industry? And how do we know that tomorrow, all of a sudden, right, you start thinking in this line, and your head begins to ache. Your head can ache for hours because the world is orderly enough for us to get along in it. Okay, with all the imperfections and all the surprises and failed plans and everything, somehow we actually get along in the world. So you start to think, well, wait a minute, what novelty there must be, and it's, how do I reconcile the seemingly irrefutable intellectual insight about novelty with the common sense observation that we are able somehow pretty much more or less to get along. And I think the key point that's somehow often hard to grasp is that it's an evolutionary system. So our expectations about institutions, others, prices, etc., emerge from our past experience. And point toward a future. Now, if we imagine a more rapid rate of change, then we have to imagine people pulling back in their plans from a more distant future to planning toward a less distant future because of that uncertainty, because of that doubt occasioned by this great rapid rate of change. Okay? So they'll pull back and plan for shorter horizons, not longer horizons. Okay, so the people plan for the as far out in time as they may reasonably do. Okay, so there's this mutual conditioning of like how far into the future we plan. So it's a kind of self-defined thing. You can plan a day ahead. You can't plan a millennium ahead. And where between one day and one millennium, how far out can we go? Well, I think the answer might be less than 5 years, judging from the Soviet experience, but...
Well, no, I don't think that's right. That's clearly not right because in the capitalist system, many profit-seeking enterprises make plans that extend well beyond 5 years.
So it's institutionally dependent, you think? A,
it's institutionally dependent. B, the problem wasn't that the Politburo picked the wrong
time
unit, right? To pick the wrong time frame. The problem was that they didn't have market prices for capital goods. Right? But it's going to depend on the industry, the firm, and the degree of specificity of your plans, how far out you can push that planning horizon. And if we imagine, that somehow that planning horizons have gotten pushed too far out and things are chaotic, then we have to imagine a kind of scaling back of the division of labor, which is going to imply a scaling back of the rate of innovation. See? So it becomes a self-adjusting process. Okay? A mutual conditioning between the elements in the system. That doesn't logically eliminate the possibility there could be periodic catastrophic collapse. Okay? Although I find that sort of Keynesian, post-Keynesian concerns about that to be exaggerated and mistaken. But it does tell you that there is this endogeneity to planning horizons and an endogeneity to the rate of novelty and innovation in an evolutionary system.
Do you see that argument as connecting with the sort of discussion of the change in the rate of technological growth that Tyler Cowen, for instance, talks about in The Great Stagnation? I'm just sort of thinking that sort of argument about this endogenous change in the rate of innovation seems a lot like some of the arguments that he makes for why he thinks that there's this.
I don't
shift.
see a connection, although that may be because I'm mistaken. I should see a connection, but I don't see that much of a connection. That book it's a funny little monograph. It's a beautiful but funny little monograph because it seems to me there's two arguments that go on at the same time, and I don't know when he's making which argument. So and one argument it's the low hanging fruit argument. Well, most of the innovations that we might do, they're pretty much, that's harder to make a new innovation now. The other argument is that, well, no, we've gone so far down the road of crony capitalism that we've got this bramble of regulations, restrictions, and monopolized elements all over the system, so that we're barring innovation from the door in order to protect people's rents, their special interests. And I never understand when he's making which argument. I don't think either argument is related to the so-called horizon principle we were talking about before, right? And I don't think it's true the first argument, the idea that somehow, we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit from the innovation tree, and so it's just natural that all future innovations are going to be more mild and fewer and farther between them. I just think that's wrong.
I guess I was thinking that you could possibly imagine sort of an issue with the horizon leading to that sort of, it's not just a question of, again, I understand that, is it a policy issue or is it just there's sort of this underlying technical change? But I guess it's interesting in that time horizon, and you say like you're not concerned about the same kind of like catastrophic collapse that post-Keynesians are.
In part because I feel I've turned that into an empirical question. Right? So it's true, pure logic isn't going to tell me whether there mightn't be, a sudden collapse of expectations, or to use a term from Lionel Robbins, a cluster of errors for no particular reason. Okay, but then, if you have a theory that tells you when that sort of thing is more likely and when that sort of thing is less likely, and you test that theory against history, and history seems to confirm that that catastrophic collapses happen when the theory predicts they're more likely, which means also something like more big player influence or money mischief. Okay, then you start to say, well, okay, experience seems to say we don't have to fear a catastrophic collapse apropos of nothing. We have to fear catastrophic collapses that are policy errors that we can correct and
if you leave those minimize. Expectations to one individual, suddenly a random sudden collapse doesn't seem as implausible as if you have a whole market.
If you leave money growth rates or centrally determined interest rates to one individual or one small body of individuals, then you have to have more fear for this sort of thing. And so all this sort of calm, sanguine attitude I have about the system just collapsing for no particular reason is reinforced by remembering the role of evolutionary shaping. Okay, so the logic often of this sort of radical subjectivism of a guy like Shackle, or of Keynes in Chapter 12, or often of Ludwig Lockman, it's a non-marginalist argument. It's like, well, we can't just sort of, it's so clear, I think, in Chapter 12 of Keynes' General Theory. Well, the future is unknowable, therefore, between right now and any moment in the future, however proximate or distant it may be, there's this great complete void and nothingness, right? So there's no gradation, there's no marginalism, there's no recognition of evolutionary shaping of the system, of our expectations, of contracts, long-term contracts helping to bridge the gap between the present and the future. It's just like, well, you never know, could fall apart. Well, that's not a theory. That's just anxiety.
Yeah, I guess I always... My reading of Lockman tempers that part of it more, I guess, than to see the Shackle or Keynes, and that, both because of the work and legacy of Max Weber, but also he has this very nice article in Towards Liberty, which is a 1972 volume, I believe, that was a Mises-Festschrift. And in it, he begins sort of his discussion of the market process and the Misesian view by saying it's so obvious that the market process coordinates these behaviors so well. What is it about the real world that causes us not to be perpetually in equilibrium? And so that text, I think, really tempers my reading of some of the more Schachelian, pure kind of we know nothing about the
Yeah.
future arguments.
Well, yeah, and in fact, Lachman has that beautiful book on capital theory, and this sort of radical subjectivism is not it's not contradicted in that book, but somehow it's not present in that book either. And I feel a certain tension between his radical subjectivism on the one hand, and then the story of equilibration he's got in that book. And I put this exact question to him once in his office, and he kind of looked at me and he got this little smile and he says, well, we understand these things better today than we did in the past. So I took this to be a kind of implicit acknowledgement that I had actually found a bit of an inconsistency in his system. On the one hand, he views equilibration within the capital structure in his famous book on same as, not really problematic. On the other hand, when he's explicitly talking about, think about expectations or subjectivism, it is problematic. Right? I think those are just two threads in Lachman so personally, right, he wasn't waiting for the sudden collapse tomorrow, but I don't think he resolved those two threads and made them harmonious in his work.
Yeah, a question that I have asked and want to explore more in the future is sort of the relationship that is in him and in subjectivist work in general between heterogeneity in lots of different areas and subjectivism. And so sort of how much does Lachman's subjectivism seem to equate with his heterogeneity? So capital is obviously subjective in that what the uses are is entirely this function of individual plans.
Go ahead.
But that also means, of course, that the set of purposes that one can put some physical object to is this heterogeneous set, and is right at the moment instantiated in all these physical things that do various things, and so the increasing heterogeneity, but also the possible heterogeneity, and how much can you collapse those two concepts?
So we have this kind of, Lachman once said to me, in Menger all things are ramified. And it's right, we have this ramifying evolutionary process. Okay, now you can't have that ramifying evolutionary process if alert entrepreneurs do not discover and act upon at least some of the new opportunities in the adjacent possible. Okay, so if you didn't have this kind of reframing of sort of the economic problem in the minds of innovating entrepreneurs, if you didn't have that, okay, you couldn't have that evolutionary process. It would grind to a halt. So there is indeed a kind of interconnection between subjectivism and this ramifying process of heterogeneity. That's right. And Pavel Kuchar has given us a really beautiful example of this in an article in the Journal of Evolutionary Economics appearing, I think, in 2015, of surrogate motherhood. Motherhood used to be a uniform idea. The mother was the mother. Then we had these new technology, these new techniques of surrogacy, and suddenly we had to distinguish between the birth mother and the genetic mother. This is a beautiful, beautiful example of how entrepreneurs had to were able not only to season a new technology and create a new market and all this wonderful stuff like that, but also how that entailed a change in our conceptual framework. Right? That's part of the entrepreneur's job, is to get us to see things differently. Okay? It's a beautiful example, I think, of exactly this process we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of, I always point out when my friends how it's made, which is the show in which they just go through the production process of some mundane goods, so the production of Louisville Slugger baseball bats, and it's
never seen it. That
it's
sounds
just
fun.
a tour of each of these factories with a little bit of narration of what each of the machines are. It's the most Hayekian show that has ever been produced on television, because you can look at it and say look, this conveyor belt, the one that is taking the wood slabs to go to a lathe that has very custom machines that make exactly the right thing to make a baseball bat, which is different than the lathe if you go and look at how they make some other object, and the conveyor belt has all these different uses, but it's also that each conveyor belt ends up being this different thing.
Yeah.
And so it's very much both illustrates the sort of iPencil idea of this radical complexity, but also just how much, the conveyor belt we think of as a capital object, but it's only meaningful capital in the context of exactly this process. If you put that random conveyor belt in, an oil factory, where their oil conveyor belt is, you would have a mess.
That happens a lot in social science. That we have a label, okay, and the label seems to imply some kind of homogeneity. But if you peel back the label, underneath it is actually heterogeneity. That happens a lot. We in our classes, we get up in front of the blackboard and draw supply and demand diagram, and then we'll have some humble example like men's shoes. Okay, but wait a minute, what do you mean men's shoes? There's different sizes, different styles, different fashions, different materials. Also, where the men's shoe is made available, how it's delivered to you, the service you enjoy when shopping for the men. Do they make you an espresso, or do you have to climb the ladder yourself to get the shoe off the out of inventory and try it on? So this is a just repeated thing. The label seeming to imply one thing, actually representing many heterogeneous elements.
Yeah, and sort of the level where the abstraction is adequate, right? So it makes sense to talk about the market for men's shoes when you want to show how changes in factors would impact a partial equilibrium. But if you're trying to model, the men's shoe market for some purpose, then you might very well, or almost certainly, are going to lead people astray, right? And that's sort of the point of the critiques of the structure, conduct, performance that you see in the sort of competition as a discovery procedure in Kerzner's work, for instance.
Yeah, the danger of labels. And you get another danger of labels you get is that sometimes the label substitutes for a model. So I see this really a lot with the work on forensic science. The forensic scientist is a scientist. So if you don't peel back that label, it's like, oh, okay, science is like a truth machine, right? And you sort of don't. Same thing with experts. Well, he's an expert, right? And it's instead valuable to peel back the label and ask, okay, so he's a forensic scientist, she's an expert, whatever. But what does that mean? How does that, if we put a person and not a truth machine in that place, what happens? If we put a person and not a truth machine under that label, forensic scientist or expert, then what happens?
How do you see your work relating to David Levy's work on experts, which I know has been pretty extensive in sort of the same veins of thinking about the epistemic properties of, knowledge generation in these various contexts?
Well, Peart and Levy have been a great influence on me. I think they've done great work. Their notion of analytical egalitarianism, I think, is really, really, really important.
What does that term mean to you? Because a lot of the time, as someone who took David Levy for History of Thought, I've tried to explain this to people before, and they've said, I don't really get what he's going after, even though they understand the particular arguments.
It's a hard point and very fundamental and a recurrent point in social science. Are you above the system or are you in the system? So famously, Adam Smith, excoriated the man of system who thinks he can move, pieces around a chessboard as if they don't have a principal emotion of their own. He forgets that if those so-called chess pieces are actually people, everyone has a principal emotion of its own. So when if you want to have a scientific understanding of society or just a scholarly understanding of society, whether you conceive of yourself as somehow a scientist or not, so you're just automatically putting yourself in a position that you're above the system and you're looking down on it. And it's easy to forget that, no, wait a minute, hold it, you're in the system. Okay, so analytical egalitarianism is putting the analyst in the model. Okay, that's hard to do, because the minute you say, okay, I want to understand, my society, or I want to understand the market process, you're imagining yourself in a posture above and on top of the system. So we have to somehow resist the temptation to stay self-contentedly in this godlike position of observation, when really, after all, we're in the system, we're not above it. Okay. This is something Hayek understood. This is something Buchanan understood. This is something Peart and Levy understand. But not everyone in the profession does understand this point.
In some ways, it's like the reverse of rational expectations. Rather than making all of our agents theorists, where this is attempting to make all the theorists agents. Right.
That's eloquently and correctly said. Yes. What I like to say sometimes, with Lucas and Lucas' critique, it's not that you would reject the Lucas critique. He had a devastating critique of those old hydraulic Keynesian models that still had, some purchase in the profession back when he was writing this critique originally. No, of course he was right about that. But with him, it's as you said, everybody's like a theorist. It's smartonomics. Everybody is super smart, including the agents in the system and the theorist. Okay? I prefer dumbonomics. Right? The people are not so smart. Neither is the theorist. Right? So there's the same epistemic equality, the same analytical egalitarianism, but it's dumbonomics, not smartonomics. Or say the same thing yet another way. With Lucas, even not only is the theorist above the system looking at the system, but the agents in the system, the actors, are able to take an out-of-body experience and look above themselves and look over themselves from the same perspective that the theorist has. So it's out-of-body economics. I prefer embodied economics.
Yeah. Jim Buchanan recounts a story a bunch of different times in his correspondence that I've been processing, where he says that they submitted a paper, him and Richard Wagner, to the Journal of Political Economy when George Stigler was the editor, on fiscal illusion, and it was rejected on the Stigler's grounds that he would not accept a paper that had imagined that people wouldn't do their arithmetic. Yeah. And so it's just such a very different view of how people are, and of course that's something that Buchanan, in his papers on Kerzner, but also stuff like Natural and Artifactual Man, sort of very much wrestled with in the Frank Knight legacy.
Let's think about this for a second in the context of behavioral economics. What you often have, you can't generalize, because after all, I think Vernon Smith would be considered a behavioral economist. I think he understands the point about analytical egalitarianism quite deeply. But often with behavioral economics, the idea is that, well, we're smart, they're dumb. Right, so we once we're clued into the logic of heuristics and biases, we smart theorists can observe them at work with agents in the system. Okay? So there's this asymmetry between the theorist and the agent. I'm smart, they're dumb. Okay, with Lucas, you have the good quality of symmetry between. Okay, but it's that I'm smart, they're smart. Okay? And I think we have to recognize, yeah, they're dumb, but careful, so are we. That's dumbonomics, right? The symmetry that recognizes the bounded rationality of both the agent and the theorist.
And then if you look at the institutional sort of world that the behavioral economics sort of leads to in the libertarian paternalism, right? You actually have these people who end up getting set up in exactly the kind of epistemic situations that your work on forensics suggests don't work out very well, right? If you're the person in charge of all of the choice architecture, rather than having this suite of different attempts to figure out what people can do, then you're liable to open yourself up to exactly the problems, both that the behavioral research thinks is ingrained in the sort of psychological machine of the brain, but also these sort of just general problems of not being exposed to a procedure of discovery.
That's right. That's exactly right. The as you said, competition, as you alluded to, competition is a discovery procedure. It's an evolutionary process. So entrepreneurs with their innovations propose, but then they're filtered. And that's an evolutionary process. That's creative. That's functional. Okay? Where when we make the expert, when we rely on the expert, boy, we put a heavy cognitive load on what, after all, is an entity no wiser, no smarter than the very agents he's supposed to be making decisions for.
Somehow, though, right, one worries in that you have a kind of, with the questions that forensics is often asked to interpret, a kind of like worry of not nihilism per se, but just that you have to do these very particular cases of history rather than just having a theory. So do you see something that could be changed so that we have a mechanism for getting closer to maybe not truth machines, but truth discovery?
Oh, well, I mean, I absolutely have argued for what, in my more theoretical work on this kind of stuff, I call democratic epistemics. In some co-authored work, I call democratic epistemics. So the basic idea is redundancy. So one of my relatively concrete proposals is, well, how about if we sometimes, just randomly, send the evidence to, say, 3 crime labs? And work in the human subjects lab suggests that 3 is the right number. We'll send the evidence to 3 crime labs instead of 1. Okay? Let's see if they give the same answer. Okay? They have to be careful. It's got to be set up right, because if we have the same biases in all 3 labs, So that's a so-called non-ergodic system with strong correlation across messages, then you have a problem. But if you set it up right, so that you have three independent labs giving truly independent judgments, okay, that redundancy clearly, I think, will improve epistemic performance of the system. You bet. So that's just a basic principle of sort of Austrian epistemics is redundancy, because it's a basic principle of evolutionary systems, is redundancy and degeneracy, which is we'll have the redundant elements get the results that they get in different ways. So they're not really identical units repeated. They're heterogeneous units, but all tending to generate the same functionality for the system. That's called in biology, that's called degeneracy. I prefer to call it ecological redundancy, because that I think conveys better the idea of what this so-called degeneracy is. It's ecological redundancy.
It sort of relates a bit to the discussions that come up every so often about the role of replication studies in science in general, and in particular in social science.
Yeah.
People often don't make the point about this ecological sort of redundancy, that not only when someone attempts to replicate a study, one's not just running exactly the same regressions using exactly the same statistical program. One's attempting to look at the same phenomena, acquire the thing. It's a pure replication. It's just a verification that someone, didn't attempt to manipulate their images or whatever in Photoshop, which, if, as someone who sometimes reads Retraction Watch, you see happen, yeah. But is different than this point.
Well, actually, it's been found that pure replication is hard to do in economics, actually. So, how big a problem is that? Well, I think it's a big problem because there's all this stuff getting published, and it's like, so we're getting smarter about it. Now you have to archive your data, and so I think we have made real improvement on it. It remains true, however, that a really good empirical result is one that's robust. Okay, so I can replicate your result, but also if I do something sort of similar but not exactly what you did, do I get the same bottom line? Okay, that's a robustness notion. Okay, and I think it remains true today, as it has been in the past, that that the economics profession tends to be a little bit insensitive about these robustness issues. We could be smarter about that.
Yeah, sometimes I think that it's also that we're content with still doing a mistake that Mises points out, and that we think that there's meaning in what the price elasticity of potatoes was from, say, 1930 to 1938 for what we should do about price elasticity of potatoes now, as if those two things could possibly be related. So in that sense, we should expect, if you run the results with new data, that you'll get possibly a different result, as opposed to the difficulty merely of replicating the old data.
Yeah, and in the sort of evolutionary system we've been describing that generates novelty, that ramifies, what are going to be the numerical constants? Well, maybe there's some, I don't know, but they're going to be not so many. What I'm more confident in are the patterns, certain general patterns that Hayek identified when we talked about explanation of the principle and pattern prediction.
And so that really gets back to those things are at a higher level of anonymity in sort of the ideal type structure of the theory. And so in a very much way shows the connections that we started with, and that how the Schutz and the phenomenology actually really is integrally under part of the epistemics of it. And that's something that really interests me, and I think is very awesome about how that structure works, because of, you read this and especially if you read some of the later phenomenologists that, say, Don Lavoie was interested in, or Gadamer, or like I tried to read Zahner once, and you sometimes get the sense that you've moved on into sort of new age, like woo,
but woo. Yes, there's a lot of woo in the sort of Heidegger and stuff coming after Heidegger, and Schutz is not in that camp. That's pre-Heidegger. So yeah, I share what seems to be your preference to stay away from the woo and which is to say the ontology. So the thing with Heidegger is that phenomenology becomes all about ontology. Now, if you go back to Schutz, he's got phenomenological psychology in his famous book, The Phenomenology of the Social World. He actually stays within the realm of what is called phenomenological psychology. So that's in this world of phenomenology, that's relatively mundane stuff. What he's not doing is transcendental phenomenology, right? Trying to somehow, unpack the ultimate structures of consciousness as they really are, trying to somehow to get to really real reality with a supercharged, turbocharged Cartesian meditation. That's not a part of the project that Schutz is working on. He's just trying to understand how the social world manifests itself in ordinary human consciousness. Okay? And then the sort of ontological, understructure for that, we don't have to be as concerned about.
I think Lavoie, tried to stick to or certainly I don't see him as engaging in taking the transcendental part of, say, Gadamer when he attempted to, go through the work on hermeneutics and connecting that as a sort of way to bring, Schutz and where research inspired by Schutz had gone to, connect those traditions rather than just having, this one brilliant thinker who was this offshoot of Mises who then has this whole body. So,
well, I mean, certainly you want to, avoid hagiography. You got to know what you're talking about. So yeah, that's only a good thing. And Don was just awesome in that regard. On the other hand, one of his students, Virgil Storr, wrote an article a few years ago, published in, I believe, the Review of Austrian Economics, saying, as I understood Virgil, saying essentially, well, we maybe in terms of the substance of it all, we probably should have just stuck with Schutz and not got on so much about this Heidegger type stuff. And that was very gratifying to me. That's kind of how I always felt. You never know. Maybe I felt that way only because I had a false or limited understanding of Heidegger, but that's always how I felt. So I felt very, gratified when Virgil came out with that view. I view him as having very much the knowledge and judgment to make that kind of a statement.
It's a very interesting sort of like piece. I always felt that the transcendental stuff was like Neoplatonism, but in continental German. But that's sort of taking us very far afield of Austrian economics.
Yeah, I'm getting a little dizzy at this point. It's very hard to think about these things, and you do have to be smart about you have to think about abstract issues if you're going to be a good economist. You have to think about stuff that's not economics, but you also have to be smart about not getting in the cul-de-sac of some abstruse thing with no path back to a real problem like how do we fix forensic science or how do we prevent business cycles from at least being too severe. So always be willing to take that crazy path out to some odd topic that doesn't look like economics, but be careful that there's a path back.
Well, I can't think of a better thing if I was going to ask you for your advice for up and coming people interested in economics than that. So at that point, I think I'm going to thank Roger for joining us here and wrap up.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.